Wow, listeners, you've really outdone yourselves this time. You've given us a ton of stuff on diet and health, articles, book excerpts, the whole shebang.
Yeah, someone's ready for a serious deep dive.
That's for sure. So we're going to roll up our sleeves and dig into it all, starting with this book by Gary Taubes, Good Calories, Bad Calories. It really shakes things up, especially when it comes to how we think about fat.
Oh, absolutely. It challenges a lot of the conventional wisdom we've all been taught about diet and health.
And maybe even makes us question some of those low-fat labels we see everywhere. Are you ready to rethink everything you thought you knew about what you eat?
I think that's what we're here for. To question, to explore, to maybe even, dare I say, debunk some myths.
Well said. And speaking of myths, Taubes goes all the way back to President Eisenhower's heart attack to kind of set the stage for how we got so obsessed with low-fat diets.
Right. And what's interesting is that even though Eisenhower's doctor put him on a low-fat diet, Taubes points out that he didn't exactly stick to it. The president continued to enjoy richer foods, the kinds of things that would be considered off limits on a strict low-fat regimen.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder if he was onto something, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe intuitively he knew that fat wasn't the enemy.
Or maybe he just really loved his food.
That too. But anyway, Taubes goes on to dismantle this whole idea that Americans suddenly started eating way more fat in the 20th century, and that's what led to the heart disease epidemic.
Uh-huh. But when you actually look at the data, the story is a bit more nuanced. It turns out that vegetable fat consumption actually increased during the peak of the heart disease epidemic.
So it's not as straightforward as more fat equals more heart disease.
Nope. And that's where things start to get really interesting. Because Taubes goes even further and starts to question the early research on cholesterol, specifically the work of Ansel Keys.
Ah, Ansel Keys, the guy who kind of became the godfather of the low-fat movement.
Exactly. His work was incredibly influential, but Taubes points out that there were other studies, like the Framingham Heart Study, that didn't show such a clear link between saturated fat and heart disease.
But for some reason, those studies were kind of pushed aside, and the focus on saturated fat as the big bad wolf just continued.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder about how scientific ideas take hold, even when there might be conflicting evidence. It's like once a certain narrative gets established, it's really hard to change people's minds.
So true. So if fat isn't the villain, then what is? Well, Tabbs has a pretty radical idea, and it involves those delicious, refined carbohydrates we all love.
Ah, yes, the white bread, the sugary treats, the processed goodies. Tab says those are the real culprits, not fat.
And he even points to this book, Pure, White, and Deadly, by John Yudkin, who was sounding the alarm about sugar way back in the 1970s. He was arguing that sugar was a major cause of heart disease and other chronic illnesses, but nobody really wanted to hear it.
Right. It's funny how certain ideas get dismissed, even when there's evidence to support them, simply because they challenge the prevailing wisdom.
Yeah, it's almost like people are afraid to change their beliefs, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as food. It's like, don't mess with my cookies.
I think that's part of it. Food is so deeply ingrained in our culture, our habits, our emotions. It's hard to let go of those beliefs, even when we're presented with new information.
So true. And to illustrate this point about the impact of refined carbs, Taubes uses the example of the Tokelau Islanders.
Mm.
They were this relatively isolated population, and their traditional diet was very low in refined carbohydrates.
Mm.
But then guess what happened when they started incorporating more Western foods?
Oh no, their health declined.
Yeah, their health went downhill.
Yeah.
And what did those Western foods have in common? More refined carbs, of course.
It's a real-life example of how dietary changes can have a huge impact on health. And it gives some weight to Tao's argument that many of the chronic diseases we face, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, they might all stem from one common cause.
And what is that common cause, you ask? It's all about how our bodies process, drumroll please, carbohydrates.
Oh, carbs, you sneaky little devils. They're so delicious, but maybe not so good for us after all.
To understand why, we got to talk about insulin and how it regulates fat storage.
Insulin, the hormone that helps control blood sugar levels.
Exactly. And when we eat refined carbohydrates, our bodies release a surge of insulin to deal with all that sugar flooding our systems. But if we keep bombarding our bodies with those refined carbs and those insulin surges, our cells start to become resistant to insulin.
And that, my friend, is where things start to go off the rails.
Insulin resistance. It's like our bodies are saying, enough is enough. We can't handle all this sugar anymore.
That's a great way to put it. And that insulin resistance is a key factor in metabolic syndrome.
Okay, metabolic syndrome. I've heard that term before, but remind me what it is again.
Think of it as a cluster of conditions: high blood pressure, high blood sugar, unhealthy cholesterol levels, all these things that put you at higher risk for serious health problems like heart disease, stroke, and diabetes.
And the kicker is that even though the official guidelines acknowledge the role of metabolic syndrome, they still seem fixated on LDL cholesterol as the primary villain.
Yeah, it's like they're missing the bigger picture.
Right. And Taubes is arguing that this focus on cholesterol might be misplaced. He thinks the real driver of these problems is insulin resistance, which is triggered by, say it with me now, the way we're eating those processed carbs.
It all comes back to those carbs. It's a real eye-opener, isn't it?
It really is. We've been so focused on fat that we've completely overlooked the potential impact of carbs, especially those refined ones. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating and, frankly, mind-blowing arguments in Taubes' book. The idea that obesity might actually be a hormonal disorder, not simply a matter of eating too much and not exercising enough.
Whoa, that's a big statement.
It is. And he challenges this whole calories in, calories out dogma that's been the cornerstone of weight loss advice for decades.
The idea that if you just eat less and move more, you'll lose weight.
Yeah, but Taubes argues that it's not that simple. And he even goes so far as to suggest that overeating might actually be a result of obesity, not the cause.
So it's not just about willpower or laziness. There's something else going on.
Exactly. He challenges the whole thrifty gene hypothesis, which says that some people are genetically predisposed to obesity because their ancestors had to store fat efficiently during times of famine.
That makes sense on the surface, but I guess it doesn't really explain why we're seeing such a rapid rise in obesity rates all over the world.
Right. It doesn't explain why we're seeing obesity even in populations that haven't experienced recent famines.
So what's the explanation then?
Well, Taubes digs into the research of scientists like Hilda Baruch and Alfred Pennington, who suggested that obesity might be driven by metabolic and hormonal factors, particularly those involving, you guessed it, insulin.
Hmm.
Remember how we talked about refined carbohydrates triggering those insulin surges?
Yeah, and how that can lead to insulin resistance.
Well, Taubes suggests that those insulin surges might also be driving fat storage. He argues that insulin is like the master regulator of fat storage. So when insulin levels are elevated, we store more fat.
Ah, I see. So the more refined carbs we eat, the more insulin our bodies produce, and the more fat we store.
It's a vicious cycle.
And it's all starting to make sense now. But if Taubes is right, it means we need a whole new way of thinking about obesity and how to treat it.
He calls it the carbohydrate hypothesis. And it basically suggests that the key to weight loss isn't restricting calories, but restricting carbohydrates, particularly those refined ones.
So instead of low-fat diets, we should be focusing on low-carb diets.
That's what Taubes proposes. It's pretty radical, isn't it? Turning everything we've been told upside down.
It is. But hey, sometimes you gotta shake things up to get to the truth. And who knows, maybe this is the missing piece of the puzzle we've been searching for.
Maybe it is. But we've covered a lot of ground already, so let's take a break here. We'll pick up this fascinating discussion next time and delve even deeper into the carbohydrate hypothesis.
You know, we've been talking a lot about cholesterol, and it's interesting how much emphasis there is on LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, as like the ultimate marker of heart health.
Yeah, like it's the only number that matters.
Yeah.
But Taubes suggests there's more to the story than just LDL. He talks about HDL cholesterol, the good cholesterol, and also triglycerides, which often get overlooked in all the cholesterol hype.
And what's really interesting is that both HDL cholesterol and triglycerides are influenced way more by what we eat, especially carbohydrates, than by any kind of fat we consume.
Wait, so you're saying what we're eating might actually affect our HDL and triglyceride levels more than the fat we're eating? That seems kind of backwards to everything we've been told.
It does, doesn't it? Back in the 1950s, Ansel Keys, the cholesterol guru, he assumed that monounsaturated fats, like olive oil, were pretty much neutral because they didn't seem to change total cholesterol levels.
So they were off the hook.
Yeah, but later research showed that was because they were actually doing two things at once. They were raising HDL, the good cholesterol, and lowering LDL, the bad cholesterol, simultaneously.
So they were having a positive effect, but it was hidden because of the way cholesterol was being measured.
Exactly, and it gets even more complicated when you look at the research on LDL cholesterol itself. Turns out LDL isn't just one thing.
What do you mean? I thought LDL was just LDL, the bad guy.
Well, a researcher named Ronald Krauss used this technique called ultracentrifugation, basically a way to separate stuff by spinning it super fast. And he showed that LDL cholesterol actually comes in different subclasses, each with its own personality.
Okay, so not all LDL is created equal. Some is worse than others.
You got it. Some of these LDL subclasses are more likely to cause heart disease than others, and they respond differently to the carbs and fats we eat.
So just looking at overall LDL levels doesn't give you the whole picture. You need to know what types of LDL you have and how they're affected by your diet. Makes sense.
Exactly. And Cross's research suggests that a diet high in refined carbohydrates might actually increase the levels of those more dangerous LDL subclasses, even if it lowers overall LDL cholesterol.
So it's like trading a bunch of small, harmless pebbles for one big, jagged rock.
Perfect analogy, and this really challenges the idea that just lowering LDL cholesterol is the magic bullet for preventing heart disease. It might not be that simple.
Okay, so we've got to be smarter about how we interpret cholesterol numbers. But what about insulin resistance? We talked about how it affects fat cells, but does it do anything to other parts of the body?
That's a great question, and the answer is a resounding yes. Insulin resistance doesn't just mess with fat cells, it can affect other tissues too. Researchers like Rosalind Yellow and Solomon Burson, who won the Nobel Prize for their work on insulin, they were among the first to point out that insulin resistance can show up in different ways depending on which tissues are being affected.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Different parts of the body react differently.
Precisely. For instance, insulin resistance in muscle tissue can lead to high blood sugar levels, while insulin resistance in the liver can contribute to high triglycerides.
And all those different effects can lead to a whole cascade of health problems.
Like a domino effect. And a Stanford University diabetologist named Gerald Reaven, he did tons of research on this connection. He focused on metabolic syndrome. Remember that cluster of conditions that increases the risk of heart disease, stroke, and diabetes?
Oh, yeah, I remember. So Reven found a strong link between insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome.
He did. And he argued that insulin resistance might be the root cause of many, if not most, cases of heart disease in America.
So it's not just about high cholesterol. It's about this broader metabolic dysfunction that's happening throughout the body.
You got it. And what's even more significant is that metabolic syndrome is linked to an increased risk of almost every chronic disease you can think of. We're talking heart disease, stroke, dementia, kidney disease, even cancer. It's not just about heart health.
Whoa, that's kind of scary. It really shows you how serious insulin resistance can be.
It is a serious issue, and it suggests that getting insulin resistance under control could be crucial for preventing and treating a whole range of chronic illnesses.
This is way bigger than just weight loss. We're talking about potentially living longer, healthier lives.
Exactly. And Taubes argues that one of the best ways to tackle insulin resistance is to, surprise, surprise, reduce our intake of refined carbohydrates.
Makes sense considering how those refined carbs triggered the insulin surges in the first place. It's all about breaking that cycle.
Absolutely. And it brings us full circle back to the core of Taubes' argument. The idea that refined carbohydrates, not fat, might be the real dietary bad guys. It's a pretty big shift in thinking.
It is, and Taubes doesn't stop there. He even suggests that refined carbohydrates might play a role in things like dementia and cancer.
Now, those are some serious accusations.
They are, but there's some interesting research to back it up. For example, he talks about studies that show a link between high blood sugar and an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease.
Wow, I've never heard that connection before. So you're saying sugar might be linked to Alzheimer's?
Some research suggests that's a possibility. It's a relatively new area of research, but it's gaining more attention and the implications are huge. If we could lower our risk of Alzheimer's just by changing what we eat, that would be incredible.
Absolutely. But what about cancer? How does sugar fit into that picture?
Well, Taubes points to research on these things called insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs for short. They're hormones that are involved in cell growth and proliferation.
And these IGFs are connected to cancer somehow. They are. High levels of IGFs have been linked to an increased risk of several types of cancer, including breast cancer and colon cancer. And here's the kicker, insulin can actually increase the levels of IGFs in the body.
So again, we see this connection between insulin and chronic disease.
Yeah.
It's like insulin is at the center of this whole web of health problems.
You nailed it. And when we eat lots of refined carbs, our bodies pump out more insulin, which can lead to higher levels of IGFs, potentially increasing our risk of cancer.
It's like this huge chain reaction, starting with those innocent-looking refined carbs.
Yeah.
This is all pretty mind-blowing. It really feels like we've been focusing on the wrong things for so long.
It does seem that way. Taubes' book really forces us to rethink our assumptions about diet and health.
It definitely does. But if we're going to shift our focus away from fat, we need to be sure that a diet low in carbs is actually safe and something people can stick with.
That's a valid point. And Taubes addresses it head on. He reminds us that for decades, the whole way we've thought about diet and chronic disease has revolved around fat.
The dogma has been low fat or else.
Exactly. And because a diet low in carbs is by nature higher in fat, it's been automatically labeled as dangerous.
So there's this knee-jerk reaction against low-carb diets. People hear high fat and they think heart attack.
Exactly. But Taubes says that reaction is based on assumptions, not necessarily on the evidence. He points to how low-carb diets have been used throughout history and how research has shown they can be effective for weight loss and might even have health benefits.
So we need to be more open-minded about low-carb diets and not dismiss them just because they go against the grain. We have to look at the science, not just our preconceived notions.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Taubes' book so important. It challenges us to question what we think we know and be open to new possibilities, even if they seem radical.
It does. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this section. Maybe it's a good place to pause and let all this sink in before we move on.
Yeah, I think a break would be good. We'll continue this discussion in our next deep dive.
Okay, so we've explored how Taubes challenges the low-fat dogma, but it's not all just tearing things down, right? He also delves into the history of low-carb diets and how they've been used, for weight loss and managing health problems.
And it's a pretty fascinating history, going all the way back to the 1860s with William Banting's little pamphlet on corpulence. It's amazing how these ideas have been around for so long.
Banting's story is pretty wild. He was this successful undertaker, of all things, who struggled with obesity. And then he lost a whole bunch of weight on a diet that was basically all meat. It was a pretty extreme approach.
Definitely not your typical diet plan. But he wasn't the only one advocating for that kind of low-carb approach. Taubes points out that there were others even earlier, like Claude Bernard, Jean-Antoine Brillat-Savarin, and Jean-François.
Wait, Brillat-Savarin, the famous food lover, the guy who practically wrote the Bible on good eating. I never would have guessed he was into low-carb diets.
It's surprising, right? But it just goes to show that these ideas have been floating around for a lot longer than we might think. And Taubes traces their evolution through all these different diet books and medical writings over the years, highlighting that common thread of restricting carbohydrates.
And he mentioned some pretty famous diet books, too, like Eat Fat and Grow Slim, Calories Don't Count, and, of course, Dr. Atkins' Diet Revolution. These were all huge bestsellers, even though they were often dismissed by mainstream medicine.
Yeah, it seems like there's always been this back and forth between conventional wisdom and these alternative approaches to diet and health.
Definitely, and Taubes really digs into that tension, examining the evidence for and against low-carb diets.
One thing he highlights is that many cultures throughout history have thrived on diets that were naturally low in carbohydrates.
Like hunter-gatherer societies, right? Their diets were high in protein and fat, but low in carbs, especially refined carbs.
Exactly. And he brings up more modern examples, too, like the Inuit and the Maasai, who traditionally ate diets that were almost entirely animal products.
Those examples really challenge the idea that we need a certain amount of carbohydrates in our diet to be healthy.
They do. It makes you wonder if the modern emphasis on low-fat, high-carb diets might actually be doing more harm than good.
That's a key point that Taubes makes throughout the book. He suggests that the shift to low-fat diets might have unintentionally increased our consumption of refined carbohydrates, which he believes are at the heart of many chronic diseases.
And he presents a lot of research to support that claim, including studies on how refined carbs affect insulin levels, blood sugar, and fat storage.
He also explains the mechanisms by which those refined carbs could contribute to heart disease, diabetes, and even cancer. It's a pretty thorough analysis of the potential downsides of how we eat today.
Very thorough. But Taubes doesn't just criticize the old way of thinking. He offers a new one, which he calls the carbohydrate hypothesis.
Right, and that hypothesis, as we've been discussing, suggests that restricting carbs, especially refined carbs, can help balance our hormones, promote weight loss, and improve our overall health.
And he makes a pretty convincing argument, backed by both historical examples and modern research. It really makes you stop and think about what you're eating.
It does. It's pretty amazing to think about how much our understanding of nutrition has changed over time.
It's been a wild ride, for sure. Lots of ups and downs, and sometimes it feels like we're just going in circles.
And we still have a lot to learn. But I think Taubes' book is a really valuable addition to the conversation. It pushes us to think critically about the information we're bombarded with and be open to new ideas, even if they challenge the status quo.
I agree. And that's what makes this kind of deep dive so important. It's not about telling you what to believe, but about giving you the tools to make your own informed decisions about your health based on the best available evidence.
Well said. So maybe by questioning conventional wisdom and exploring different perspectives, we can all become a little bit healthier and a little bit wiser.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, and I hope you found it as thought-provoking as we have.
It's been great exploring these ideas with you.
Likewise. And all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.